In the first few days of this year, I was very surprised at the lengths to which an incumbent US president would seemingly go to retain power. We were at a point so clearly defeated in an election, and for whose procedures, incidentally, he as the most senior national executive had responsibility. He had tried to hold on to power by subterfuge, cajolery, extra legal action, and even trying to find extra votes. And if the recently published very critical warning letter by the 10 living former Secretaries of State for Defense is to be believed, by actually contemplating calling out the military and imposing martial law. And yet, the very next day, the 6th of January, the president held a rally outside the White House and incited his thousands of supporters to march on the Capitol in order to prevent the counting of the votes in the Electoral College. Trump encouraged his supporters to fight, fight. You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength. You have to be strong. And then his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, encouraged trial by combat. As the world watched in horror, the mob stormed the joint session of Congress in some 21st century rerun of the Bolshevik 1917 storming of the Winter Palace. As The Economist stated so clearly, be in no doubt that Donald Trump is the author of this attack on the heart of American democracy. His lies fed the grievance, his disregard for the Constitution focused on Congress, and his demagoguery lit the fuse. And as I spake today on the 11th of January, Congress will today debate whether or not to impeach him for a second time. Meanwhile, his cabinet considers, and to some extent conspires, whether to remove him under the 25th, the Unfit for Office Amendment, and indeed many across the world think he should voluntarily resign. Maybe the president was indeed hoping to precipitate a coup, but if so, it was the most incompetent coup in history. Thankfully, come what may, he leaves office in just 10 days. But we should realize that he and his army of buffalo-horned good old boys still remain. So with his departure, it's appropriate to ask, what internationally is his legacy? Well, as it turned out, a man who thought he had all the answers actually had very few. A man who had bullied his way across the boardrooms of America came unstuck when he came up against what Otto von Bismarck and Willy Brandt described as realpolitik. His failures are legion, but let me just think about two. His attempts to persuade Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons actually gave that dictator the glow of diplomatic respectability. It cemented his position within North Korea and encouraged his people to subject themselves to yet more degradation to support Kim Jong-un in designing a new nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. But equally tellingly, Trump's Make America Great Again slogan then proved disastrous, not only in thwarting action on climate change, but also for its impact on world trade. The global marketplace for goods and services has increasingly fragmented under his leadership into nationalistic regional markets, as Trump began a trade war with China almost immediately on taking office. He then withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, sought to limit the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and even began attempts to dismantle the World Trading Organization, the WTO. If these were not bad enough, he then began to antagonize even his allies, using his well-tried bully methods. But sadly for him, these tactics did not work, and they backfired. Indeed, Western leaders were inadvertently recorded mocking him behind his back at a cocktail party at the NATO summit in December 2019, causing Mr. Trump to leave the summit early in a fit of pique. Although, of course, he pretended to have good relations with Mr. Putin, his relations with others are somewhat strained. Peacetime Sino-US relations could hardly be much worse, and these have been exacerbated still further just last week, when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo removed all restrictions on relations between the US and Taiwan, seemingly supporting further its independence. Thereby, of course, considerably irritating Beijing, who considers Taiwan, of course, to be a province of China. Meanwhile, US antagonism has actually encouraged China to proceed still further down an independent path, continuing her annexation of the South China Sea, while at the same time progressing her built to develop a Silk Road, but also across much of underdeveloped Africa. From being a very minor world player just a few years ago, Chinese influence now stretches across much of the globe, including to many of the places where, when Donald Trump came to power, the US used to be dominant. And of course, if this were not bad enough, then just last year, along comes COVID. Now, of course, that the World Health Organization has recently just been denied access to investigate, doubt is increasing about how and where the pandemic originated. Possibly in some fish market in Wuhan, or even perhaps from a bioweapons laboratory nearby. But the virus caused a pandemic whose effects probably won't be fully understood until the 2050s. Just as the Black Death of 1347 changed the face of feudal Europe, and the so-called Spanish flu of 1918-1919 collapsed economies, killed maybe 50 million, and arguably hastened decolonization. So this 2020-2021 pandemic is sure to precipitate economic scourge. A scourge with unemployment, particularly amongst the youth of the world, at unimaginable heights. And this alone will generate considerable global change. Already, as we recognize, much of the West's retail sector is in retreat. Businesses are on the standstill, high streets becoming empty, and many of the world's workers now operating entirely from home. Amongst this, the world's richest men are new men, people like Jeff Bezos, who runs the Amazon shopping empire, and Elon Musk, whose high technology companies look set to lead industry into a post-fossil fuel world. But what of events closer to home in Europe? While the worker power base of much of the 20th century has seemed in decline, a new powerful group seems now to have emerged. What Margaret Thatcher once labelled as Mondeo man, the relatively undereducated lower middle class, the artisans, they have become a nationalist, largely anti-immigration force to be reckoned with. The Gilets jaunes in France brought Paris to a standstill for many weeks. In Germany gave the AfD an electoral boost that seemed to lead them to power. And in Britain, the same group not only rejected European membership, but it also catapulted Boris Johnson, that one-time petty journalist, to the height of political power, a position for which he was, incidentally, entirely unprepared and unsuited. And both he and Trump share a number of characteristics. Both relied on their supposed charisma. Both, it has to be said, support a charismatic, tonsorial image. Both are utterly amoral, and both seem to believe they are above the law. So where does this bring us into 2021 and perhaps beyond? Hardly a rosy prospect, it seems. An America in chaos, a Europe without Britain, opportunistic China, and a pandemic that has produced already over 90 million cases and over 2 million reported deaths. Although the advent of mass vaccination may well bring the pandemic to an early halt, the virus will likely mutate to re-emerge in waves for years to come. Though hopefully, each wave will be rather less virulent than the last. However, the consequent economic pandemic cannot be so easily treated, with most, if not all, nations now facing a super debt. Debt which, like the ocean, have undiscovered depths, and where sudden shocks produce tsunami-like effects on local economies. Under the economic models of the last century, these debts would have been entirely unsupportable, and we would now be facing a new Great Depression, perhaps the then inexorable rise of fascist politicians who said they had all the answers, and maybe even a conflict that might follow once their remedies proved entirely hollow. Hopefully, however, our new economic understanding will prevent this enlarged ocean of debt from swamping and submerging us. But that will all hinge on one factor: confidence. And it's confidence that we have to hope for. Maybe, and just maybe, the world is taking a reality pill for 2021, beginning next week on the 20th of January. On that day, President Biden will take office, assuming, of course, there are no more attempted coups in the USA. He promises a new global approach to the politics of the US. Free mass vaccination in the US will hopefully expunge COVID there. He will revitalize the US economy through trillion-dollar loans, and then re-establish the US as the leader by mending bridges with the US allies. Though his relationships with China has yet to be elaborated in detail, and his attitude in both North Korea and Iran have yet to be developed, yet there still is some cause for hope. His first act on taking office is said to be to rejoin the Paris Accord on Climate Change, and he has also indicated that he would rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iraq and the P5+1 that was announced in July 2015. But there are two caveats. Each is somewhat problematic. The first is that Biden's economic stimulus relies on taking on a massive amount of new debt, which, if it works like Roosevelt's New Deal, will be highly beneficial, but which conversely does risk the possibility of uncontrolled inflation. And the second is Mr. Biden's age. The world is placing its trust in a grandfatherly figure of 78, whose health is uncertain, and whose aspirations and policies are unlikely to be accomplished in just one term of office. And if by 2024 his policies are seen to be wavering, then the door reopens for a revitalized Trump or one of his henchmen. Meanwhile, across the pond in Europe, the situation is also somewhat improving. Arguably, the departure of Britain will probably help the EU with the economic recovery from COVID, since amongst other things, the 750 billion euro recovery plan probably would not have been passed if Britain was still in. Now, Ursula von der Leyen can also hasten the deployment of the COVID vaccine across the continent and start to forge an economy that can take advantage of the opportunities that are presented in the post-COVID world. In Britain too, some sense has actually been re-injected. Under the triple threats of Biden's anti-Brexit policy, a COVID crisis exacerbated by sheer mismanagement, and the obvious devastation an isolated Britain would face if having to rely on purely WTO terms, Boris Johnson finally agreed at the 11th hour to a trading deal with the EU, even though I have to say many suspect he has little attempt to it. Johnson, a COVID victim himself, and someone for whom the harsh reality and responsibility of high office did not, it has to be said, match up to his fantasist dream, can and must now expunge the Brexiteer lunacy and the blindly loyal disciples from his government. And then he should start to run the country with fresh eyes. Sadly, though, a post-Brexit pile-up, a traffic jam of lorries on both sides of the channel, with exports of our fish rotting in Dover and imports of fruit and vegetables coming into the country rotting in Calais, doesn't look much like the Brits enjoying the benefits of his slogan of taking back control. The union with Northern Ireland has already been stretched, and Belfast is now economically more tied to Dublin than London. And moreover, with even Wales discussing independence, Johnson will now have to foil Scotland's own attempts to take back control. It has to be said that adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan have curbed much of the British appetite for intervention. And under Johnson and his nodding donkey supporters, the appetite is really for more spectacle. Braggadocio, as the FT has labelled it, show entirely without substance. But according to him, Britain is still set to regain its maritime prowess. Soon the carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth will cross the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean to exercise freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. As the FT has noted, this is straight out of the Rule Britannia school of foreign policy. The foray is rich in imperial nostalgia, no doubt with lots of flag waving, but is miles distant from reality. Our carrier may well have to borrow USMC, United States Marine Craft aircraft to operate, and if threatened, would have to rely on the United States Navy to provide Aegis surface cover from their cruisers. But even despite the dear Mr. Johnson, the UK still has real commitments and capabilities, and the world should note that. The UK retains a seat on the United Nations Security Council as one of the P5. Here, the arguments of British diplomats are still quite well respected. Our intelligence services are still world class, and our defence forces remain limited but potent. While this government can easily be ridiculed and mocked, the country is still but calming across the board. Even in Turkey, the aggressive nationalism of President Erdogan seems less assertive than hitherto. Surprisingly, after the attempted coup of the 6th of January, state radio in Ankara condemned the actions of Mr. Trump's supporters. And these are the very people that the nationalist Mr. Erdogan would probably have been most likely to wish to support. Perhaps he, like many world leaders, had to modify his approach in the wake of COVID. And if this pandemic has had any beneficial effect, perhaps, just perhaps, it has reduced some of the tensions and the virulence of some conflicts. Perhaps a new fog has replaced the fog of war. So as we enter the 2020 decade, can we be confident? We may have a vaccine, but sadly we must be realistic. Aggressive aspirations haven't melted away. Pent-up hatreds haven't evaporated, and economic differences haven't been resolved. But perhaps COVID and Biden together have already achieved at least one good thing. They have brought us a breathing space. Let's not waste it. Thank you very much.